The Prime Minister has announced the Commonwealth will split the cost of the virus public health response with the states, the bill anywhere up to $1 billion. It comes ahead of the unveiling of the details of the Morrison government's virus stimulus package and just how much the government is going to spend. The Prime Minister is on the record as saying Labor's $50 billion global financial crisis stimulus was reckless. But former Rudd advisor Andrew Charlton says the stimulus spend may have to be massive. Andrew Charlton, welcome to The Business.
Thank you.
Andrew, the economy is in need of some big stimulus here as businesses face an uncertain future in the environment of COVID-19. The Treasurer says that his stimulus package will be in the billions of dollars. Of course, overnight we heard the US approve an $8 billion package there. How big does an Australian stimulus package need to be?
Well, look, it needs to be significant, but the most important thing is that it needs to be different to the types of stimulus that Australia has used in the past. In the past, the standard formula for the Australian government when we get into trouble is to have a bit of a cash splash and a few rate cuts and let the economy recover. But this is a different kind of crisis. It is emanating from what economists call a supply shock rather than a demand shock. And that needs a different kind of stimulus. A supply shock is relatively immune to dropping cash on the economy because a supply shock isn't about encouraging consumers back to the shops. It's about making sure that broken supply chains and factories that are closed can reopen.
Of course, there's a lot of discussion about and comparison, I guess, to the GFC. That was the last big economic crisis that we faced here. $50 billion was poured into stimulus packages then. Right now, or more recently, the PM, the Treasurer have denounced those measures back in 2008 and 2009 as reckless and the work of panic merchants. Have they boxed themselves into a corner with that kind of rhetoric and now find themselves dealing with the coronavirus situation?
Well, look, of course, that was political rhetoric from that side of politics. And I hope that they move away from that quite quickly, because the reality is that if the coronavirus does play out in a negative scenario, then the government will be required to implement very significant stimulus. And the 2008-2009 stimulus helped ensure that Australia was one of very few advanced economies in the entire world not to go into recession. And that wasn't a waste of money. That saved Australia an enormous cost that would have otherwise been incurred in people being unemployed, businesses being shut down, and growth slowing.
Of course, one of the key pillars of that stimulus package a decade ago was cash handouts. The government has ruled that out this time around, but do you think they're effective?
Well, look, there's no question that the $900 cheques that were rolled out to many Australians got them back into the shops. In the early part of the crisis, we saw a huge drop in retail sales. Lots of retailers were telling us that they'd taken a massive hit, and we saw that in the official numbers. And then as soon as those cheques went out, Australians went back to the shops, and we saw them that money rolling through the tills, re-employing workers in the retail sector and getting the economy moving.
Now, of course, as you said, this crisis is very different because it deals with supply issues. How do you address that?
Well, what we've seen in the last week is the impotence of stimulus measures on supply shocks. The US Federal Reserve implemented an emergency 50 basis point cut, and the markets shrugged and then tanked. In South Korea, they implemented a significant fiscal stimulus. However, that stimulus did almost nothing in terms of the immediate supply side problem of getting those factories back operational, which actually requires workers coming back to work and inputs coming across from China. So a supply shock requires support to help businesses who are going through dislocations. And that needs to be targeted support in the form of cash flow support or credit support to affected businesses, particularly small businesses, and those businesses who are in the eye of the storm in the retail, hospitality and education sectors.
The Treasurer has said that that is a key concern to keep people in jobs. What happens if they can't do that? If this continues for months and we start to see people losing their jobs, how does that impact the broader economy?
Well, that will switch this crisis into a new and dangerous phase, flipping it from a supply shock into a demand shock, where consumers will be very anxious about their expenditures if they fear that they may lose their jobs. And at that point, that is when full-blown fiscal and monetary support will be required to lift aggregate demand and prevent Australia going into a negative spiral. It's important to note here that the money that the government spends on fiscal stimulus is paid back many-fold if that money avoids us falling into a recession. It's paid back many-fold in the taxes that aren't otherwise lost, in the businesses that don't go out of the business, and the workers that aren't thrown onto the unemployment queues.
How much should the government be spending here?
Well, it's too early to tell. What we don't know is exactly how this virus crisis will play out, but what we do know is that the tail risks could be very severe. And so we should be planning for a range of different scenarios that could include immediate short-term supply-side type stimulus measures, as well as medium and longer-term demand-side stimulus measures. And in some negative scenarios, those stimulus measures may need to be very significant indeed, on the scale of the types of measures that were seen in the global financial crisis. But what's important now is to be prepared for a range of different scenarios, rather than jump to assuming that one scenario is going to be the outcome.
How big are we at a risk of recession here?
Well, I think there's a very material risk. It's by no means a certainty, but the truth is that the government has already announced that we've taken a 0.5% hit to GDP just in two sectors alone. That's the education and tourism sector. And there's no question that as the virus spreads, that fallout will significantly increase. So there is a big chance that the current quarter becomes negative, and then the question is, will those effects be persistent into the next quarter, delivering two negative quarters, which constitutes a technical recession?
Andrew Charlton, great to talk to you on The Business. Thank you.
Thank you.